The young girl's fingers trembled as they white-knuckled the expensive fabric of the stranger's lapel. "Please, they took my mama." The silver clink of cutlery stopped. The low hum of elite conversation died instantly. Because the man she had collapsed in front of wasn't just another diner. He was the Lion of the Underground, a man whose name was only spoken in whispers. And the split-second decision he made in that restaurant would become a legend that left the entire city speechless. It was supposed to be a night of calculated business at an exclusive restaurant, a place where the city's most powerful men traded secrets over polished mahogany and soft candlelight. At the head of the most prominent table sat Leo Catania. Tense, alert, and clean-shaven, he commanded the room with a rigid, authoritative posture that demanded total submission. He had built his empire on a foundation of iron-fisted control and one absolute law. Never let the past in, and never show a flicker of mercy. For decades, Leo had been a man of stone, successfully burying the trauma of the day he watched his own mother disappear. He believed his heart was an impenetrable fortress. Until a tearful child in a light-colored dress burst through the doors, fell at his feet, and begged the most dangerous man in the city for the one thing he had sworn never to give. The atmosphere inside Loro Puro was one of suffocating refinement. Here, the air was thick with the scent of aged truffle and the metallic tang of unspoken power. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears from the ceiling, casting a warm, deceptive glow over men who dealt in the cold currency of fear. At the center of it all sat Leo Catania. He was a man carved from shadow and obsidian, his presence so absolute that the very waiters seemed to hold their breath as they approached his table. Leo didn't need to raise his voice to command the room. His silence did the heavy lifting. He sat with a rigid, authoritative posture, his dark hair catching the light as he leaned slightly over a glass of vintage Barolo. Across from him, two high-ranking associates spoke in hushed, hurried tones, their eyes darting to Leo's face like sailors watching a darkening horizon for signs of a storm. They were presenting a proposal for a new territory, but Leo's expression remained an impenetrable mask of clinical indifference. To him, these men were not partners, they were chess pieces in a game he had already won. The restaurant was a fortress of his own making, a place where the elite paid for the privilege of being near his orbit while praying they never caught his direct gaze. Every clink of a silver spoon against porcelain felt dampened, as if the diners were afraid of disturbing the gravity that Leo exerted. He was the Lion of the Underground, a predator who had spent decades perfecting the art of emotional detachment. He had built an empire on the belief that feelings were a poison, a luxury for the weak that led only to the grave. As Leo finally raised the glass to his lips, his eyes remained wide and alert, scanning the room with the practiced paranoia of a king who knows the price of his crown. There was no room for error in his world, and certainly no room for mercy. He was untouchable, a man who had successfully buried his humanity beneath layers of silk and steel. The dinner was proceeding with the rhythmic, bloodless efficiency Leo demanded. The world outside the heavy mahogany doors was irrelevant. He was the master of this gilded silence, and he intended to keep it that way. He had forgotten, or perhaps simply refused to remember, that even the strongest fortresses have a breaking point. And that sometimes, the greatest threats to a man's armor don't come from a rival's bullet, but from a truth he thought he had outrun. The heavy mahogany doors of Loro Puro didn't just open, they were flung wide with a frantic, desperate force that shattered the restaurant's curated tranquility. The rhythmic clink of silver and the low murmur of million-dollar deals vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by the ragged, uneven gasps of a child. Every head in the room turned. The elite of the city, men and women who prided themselves on never being surprised, stared in stunned silence as a small, trembling figure stumbled into the center of the dining room. It was Betty, a young blonde girl whose light-colored dress was wrinkled and stained with the dust of the streets. Her eyes were wide, watery, and rimmed with a terrifying shade of red that spoke of hours of weeping. She didn't look at the glittering chandeliers or the shocked socialites. Her gaze was locked onto the one man whose aura of authority acted like a lighthouse in her storm. She didn't stop until she reached the head table. With a sob that seemed to tear through the very air, she fell at Leo Cattanio's feet. Her small, pale hands reached out, white-knuckling the expensive silk of his black suit jacket as if it were a life raft in a churning sea. "Please," she choked out, her voice a thin, fragile thread that vibrated through the silent hall. "Please. They took my mama. They put her in the black van, and they took her." The tension in the room became a physical weight. Leo's associates half rose from their chairs, their hands instinctively reaching for the concealed holsters beneath their jackets, their faces twisted in confusion and offense at this intrusion. The patrons at the surrounding tables watched with a mix of horror and morbid curiosity, waiting for the lion to roar, to snap his fingers and have this ragged interruption discarded like a piece of trash. Leo remained motionless, his posture rigid and authoritative, but his eyes told a different story. As Betty's small frame shook against his knees, her tears soaking into his lapel, the iron walls he had built around his soul began to hairline fracture. He looked down at the child seeking safety and reassurance from the most dangerous man in Boston, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, the polished restaurant floor seemed to dissolve into a memory of a rain-slicked street from 25 years ago. The silence of the elite crowd was deafening, a vacuum of expectation that pressed against his chest. They expected a cold dismissal, they expected the predator to remain unmoved. But as Leo's hand slowly hovered over the girl's shoulder, the cold master of Loro Puro was gone, replaced by a man who had just heard a ghost speak. The scent of expensive truffle and aged wine vanished, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of rain on hot asphalt. In the theater of Leo's mind, the elegant restaurant walls dissolved into the jagged skyline of a crumbling neighborhood 25 years in the past. He wasn't the lion anymore. He was just Leo, a 10-year-old boy with scraped knees and a heart full of unearned terror. The memory was a grayscale nightmare that played on a loop in his darkest hours. He saw himself standing behind a rusted chain-link fence, his small fingers hooked into the wire so tightly they bled. A black van, its engine idling with a guttural, predatory growl, sat at the curb. He watched, paralyzed by a silence he couldn't break, as two men in dark coats forced his mother, Elena, toward the open sliding door. She hadn't screamed, she had only looked back at him, her eyes wide and pleading, the exact same shade of desperate blue he now saw in Betty's gaze. "Leo, run," she had mouthed, but his feet were lead. He had stayed rooted to the spot, a spectator to his own soul being torn away. The door had slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the decades, and the van had peeled away, leaving nothing but a cloud of acrid exhaust and the sound of his own ragged breathing. He had stood there for hours, waiting for a savior who never came, eventually realizing that in a world of predators, the only way to survive was to become the most dangerous one of all. That day, Michael Rodriguez had died, and Leo Cattanio had been born from the ashes. He had sworn a silent, blood-soaked oath to the empty street that he would never be helpless again. He had spent a quarter-century building a fortress of power and indifference, convincing himself that by feeling nothing, he could never be hurt again. He had convinced himself that he had forgotten the weight of that silence. But as Betty's small, shaking hands continued to clutch his jacket, the silence of the past collided with the silence of the restaurant. The why behind every cold order he had ever given, every rival he had crushed, and every wall he had built was suddenly stripped bare. He wasn't just looking at a stranger's child, he was looking at the ghost of the boy he used to be, still standing behind that fence, begging for someone to finally move. The ice that had encased his heart for 25 years didn't just melt, it shattered under the pressure of a promise he had kept buried for far too long. He realized that the debt he owed wasn't to his associates or his empire, it was to the boy who had watched the black van drive away. The silence in the restaurant was no longer a sign of respect, it was a vacuum of disbelief. Leo Cattanio remained seated for a heartbeat longer, his gaze fixed on the small, trembling hand still gripping his lapel. His business associates leaned in, their faces masks of irritation and impatience. "Leo," "Sit the girl down and let's finish the negotiation," one whispered, his voice dripping with condescension. "We have a schedule. The security will handle the domestic trash." Leo didn't look at him. He didn't even acknowledge the man had spoken. Instead, he placed his large, steady hands on Betty's shoulders. The movement was slow, deliberate, and possessed a terrifying gravity. He stood up, his tall, imposing frame casting a long shadow over the table of elite power brokers. The shift in his energy was palpable. The cold, calculating businessman had vanished, replaced by a predator that had finally found its target. "Leo," the associate pressed, his voice rising in confusion. "What are you doing? This is $1 million. Leo turned his head just enough to catch the man in his peripheral vision. The look in his eyes was so absolute, so devoid of hesitation, that the associate's words died in his throat. Leo reached into his inner pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped a single contact. He didn't wait for a greeting. "I want every camera within a 10-block radius of the green residence pulled," Leo said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that cut through the room like a blade. "Look for a black van. No plates, or swapped ones. I want a trajectory, a warehouse, or a hole in the ground where they're hiding. If a bird flies over that vehicle, I want to know its wingspan." "Boss?" The voice on the other end crackled. "We're in the middle of the shipment prep. You want us to drop everything for a kidnapping?" Leo looked down at Betty, whose watery eyes were fixed on him with a spark of desperate hope. He saw his mother's face. He saw the boy he used to be. "Did I stutter?" Leo asked, and the coldness in his tone made the guards at the door visibly flinch. "Find the van. Now. If she isn't found within the hour, don't bother coming back." He snapped the phone shut and looked at his associates, who were staring at him as if he had lost his mind. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't owe them a single word. He reached down, took Betty's small hand in his, and began to walk toward the exit. Behind him, the lion's feast was over. The business of the night was no longer profit, it was retribution. The city didn't just wake up, it trembled. From the neon-drenched docks of the harbor to the rain-slicked alleys of the industrial district, the machinery of Leo Cattanio's empire hummed into a violent, synchronized life. The order had gone out, and in the underworld, an order from the lion was not a suggestion, it was a seismic event. Black SUVs with tinted windows tore through the intersections of the financial district, ignoring red lights as they fanned out like a precision strike team. Tires screeched against the pavement, the sound echoing off the glass skyscrapers like a predatory howl. This wasn't a standard operation, there was a frantic, desperate edge to the movement that the city hadn't felt in years. Street-level informants, from the corner lookouts to the warehouse foremen, felt the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The lion's feast had been abandoned, and in its place, a scorched earth hunt had begun. At the central hub of Leo's private security firm, the hum of high-end servers filled the room. Dozens of monitors flickered with grainy feeds from traffic cameras, ATM vestibules, and private doorbell recordings. Technicians worked with sweating brows, their fingers flying across keyboards as they bypassed firewalls and decrypted city transit data. Every black van in the tri-state area was flagged, analyzed, and discarded within seconds. The digital net was tightening, fueled by the terrifying knowledge that their boss was no longer calculating profit margins, he was hunting for a ghost. On the streets, the scale of Leo's influence was laid bare. Business stopped. Even the rival factions pulled back into the shadows, sensing the raw, unbridled fury radiating from the Cattanio inner circle. This was no longer about territory or narcotics, it was a demonstration of absolute reach. A child had asked for help, and in response, the most powerful man in the city had turned the urban landscape into a giant, searching eye. The city screams wasn't a metaphor, it was the sound of sirens, the roar of high-performance engines, and the panicked whispers of men who realized that tonight, there was nowhere to hide. Somewhere in the concrete labyrinth, a black van was moving, unaware that the entire weight of the city's darkness was about to collapse upon it. Leo sat in the back of his own lead vehicle, his hand still resting protectively near Betty's, his eyes fixed on the tablet in his lap. The coordinates were blinking. The prey had been sighted. The lion was no longer waiting for the world to come to him, he was tearing the city apart to find what was lost. The lead SUV skidded to a halt in front of a rusted, derelict warehouse on the edge of the industrial canal. The air here was thick with the smell of stagnant water and rotting timber, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of the restaurant Leo had abandoned. As the doors of the convoy flew open, a dozen enforcers stepped out, their movements disciplined and lethal. They carried tactical rifles and wore Kevlar, their faces set in grim masks of professional violence. But as Leo Catania stepped out of the lead vehicle, it was clear that the most dangerous weapon on the premises didn't have a trigger. Leo didn't draw a weapon. He didn't scream orders. He simply adjusted the cuff of his black suit and began to walk toward the sliding steel doors of the warehouse. His silence was a physical pressure, a cold vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the night air. His men followed 2 paces behind, their boots echoing on the cracked pavement, but Leo's footsteps were nearly silent, the gait of a predator that had already smelled the blood of its prey. Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of shadows, illuminated only by a few flickering industrial lamps. A group of men stood near a battered black van, their voices raised in a panicked argument that died instantly as the heavy steel doors groaned open. They were the bottom feeders Leo had envisioned, debt collectors who mistook cruelty for power. When they saw the silhouette of the lion framed by the moonlight, the leader reached for a handgun tucked into his waistband, his fingers trembling. Leo didn't flinch. He didn't even slow his pace. He walked directly into the center of the light, his eyes wide and alert, fixed on the leader with a terrifying, clinical focus. The gunman looked at Leo's enforcers, who had their sights trained on every vital organ in the room, but their real fear was reserved for the man in the suit. Leo stopped exactly 6 feet away. He stood with a rigid, authoritative posture, his hands at his sides, radiating a level of calm that was more unnerving than a scream. The leader of the kidnappers opened his mouth to make a demand, to talk about debts and leverage, but the words withered under Leo's gaze. In that silence, the kidnappers realized they hadn't just taken a woman, they had invited a hurricane into their home. Leo's silence spoke of a man who had already decided their fates, a man who was no longer bound by the rules of business or the laws of the street. He wasn't there to negotiate. He was there to reclaim what was lost, and the sheer weight of his presence made the warehouse feel like a tomb. The air grew colder as Leo finally tilted his head, his voice a low, lethal rasp that broke the stillness. "Where is she?" The heavy silence in the warehouse was punctured only by the sound of a woman's muffled sobbing coming from the back of the van. Leo didn't need to see her to know it was Janet. The sound vibrated against the walls of his chest, harmonizing with the phantom cries of his mother that had echoed in his mind for 25 years. He stepped further into the flickering light, his eyes moving from the leader's trembling handgun to the faces of the 3 men surrounding him. They were exactly what he had suspected, men who mistook cruelty for strength and desperation for leverage. They wore cheap leather jackets and expressions of false bravado, the kind of bottom feeders who operated in the cracks of the city, too cowardly to face a peer and too greedy to leave the innocent alone. As Leo looked at them, the warehouse seemed to shift. For a split second, these weren't just kidnappers. They were the same faceless monsters who had driven that black van away in his childhood. They were the architects of his lifelong isolation, the reason Michael Rodriguez had to die so that Leo Catania could survive. "You're Catania," the leader stammered, his voice cracking as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. We didn't know the woman was yours. We were just collecting on a debt. Her brother, he owes." "I don't care about the debt," Leo interrupted, his voice a low, lethal rasp that made the other men instinctively take a step back. "And she isn't mine." But the girl who fell at my feet, she is. The leader's eyes darted toward the exit, but Leo's enforcers stood there like statues of granite and steel. There was no escape. Leo walked forward, ignoring the barrel of the gun pointed at his heart. He had lived his whole life preparing for this moment of reckoning. He reached out and wrapped a hand around the leader's wrist, his grip like an industrial vice. With a slow, terrifying pressure, he forced the man's arm down until the gun pointed at the floor. "You hurt a mother to get to a man," Leo whispered, leaning in until his cold breath grazed the kidnapper's ear. "You left a child alone in the dark to cry for a savior. I know men like you. I've been hunting men like you since I was 10 years old." The raw, unbridled fury in Leo's eyes was more effective than any bullet. He saw the leader's spirit break, the man's knees buckling under the weight of Leo's absolute authority. In this den of shadows, the lion wasn't just defending a stranger, he was finally confronting the ghosts of his past. He didn't need to pull a trigger to destroy them. He simply had to show them what happens when the boy who was left behind finally grows up. "Open the van," Leo commanded. "Now." The heavy sliding door of the van groaned open, revealing a world of cramped shadows and the sharp scent of fear. Inside, Janet R. Shipman sat huddled on the cold floor, her hands bound and her eyes wide with a terror that only a mother knows. When the light hit her, she flinched, expecting the worst. But instead of the sneering face of a debt collector, she saw the silhouette of a man who looked like he had been forged from the very night itself. Leo reached in, his large hand surprisingly gentle as he used a pocketknife to slice through her restraints with a single, practiced motion. He didn't say a word, he didn't have to. The authority in his posture and the strange, quiet empathy in his eyes told her that the nightmare was over. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she stumbled out of the vehicle and into the cool air of the warehouse. Outside, the silence of the industrial district was broken by the sound of small, frantic footsteps hitting the pavement. Betty was running, her light-colored dress fluttering like a moth's wings in the moonlight. She had slipped past the enforcers at the perimeter the moment she saw the van door open. "Mama," the girl's voice pierced the night, a high, soaring note of pure relief. Janet collapsed to her knees just as Betty collided with her, the child's small arms wrapping around her neck in a desperate, suffocating embrace. They clung to each other, sobbing, a frantic tangle of blonde hair and tear-stained cheeks. Standing a few feet away, Leo Catania watched them. His rigid, authoritative posture remained, but his hands were clenched at his sides. As he witnessed the reunion, the ghosts of 25 years ago finally grew quiet. He watched Janet stroke Betty's hair, murmuring promises that they were safe, that it was over, and that they would never be parted again. It was the moment he had waited for his entire life, the closure he had never received, played out right in front of him for someone else. He felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth crack the ice around his heart. For a quarter of a century, he had been the boy behind the fence, watching the black van drive away into the rain. But tonight, he was the man who had stopped the van. He had changed the ending. In the reflection of their joy, Leo found a fragment of the piece he had lost as Michael Rodriguez. He wasn't just the lion of the underground anymore, he was a man who had finally brought someone home. In the weeks that followed, the story of what had happened at the industrial canal rippled through the city like a slow-moving tide, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. The elite patrons of Loro Puro still spoke in hushed tones about the night the lion had walked away from $1 million deal to answer the plea of a terrified child. The underworld, usually fueled by rumors of war and betrayal, found itself grappling with a new, unsettling truth. Leo Catania was no longer just a man who ruled through fear, he had become a man who commanded a different kind of power, the power of a protector. Leo's transition was subtle but absolute. He still wore the black suits, still sat with a rigid, authoritative posture, and still held the city's darkness in his hands. But the lion's den had changed its purpose. The vast network of informants and enforcers that once only hunted for profit now served as a silent, invisible shield around the vulnerable. Word spread through the back alleys and the high-rises. In Leo's city, the innocent were off-limits. The bottom feeders and predators who once thrived in the cracks of the city's indifference found the shadows shrinking, chased away by a man who now knew the value of a promise kept. For Janet and Betty, the world had been remade. They lived in a quiet, sun-drenched apartment in a neighborhood where the streetlights never flickered and the locks were always secure. They didn't see Leo often, but they felt his presence in the trust fund that ensured Betty's education and the discreet security that watched over them from a distance. To the rest of the world, he remained the untouchable Don, but to a small blonde girl who often sent him drawings of lions with gold crowns, he was simply Uncle Leo, the man who had heard her voice when no one else would. Leo often stood on his balcony, overlooking the city he had once viewed only as a ledger of debts and assets. He was no longer the boy behind the rusted fence, and he was no longer the man with walls around his heart. By saving Betty's mother, he had finally rescued the version of himself that had been trapped in that rainy memory for 25 years. The city was speechless because they didn't understand that the hardest hearts are often the ones that beat the strongest once they are broken open. Leo Catania had discovered that true royalty wasn't found in the fear he inspired, but in the safety he provided. The lion had found his pride, and for the first time in his life, the silence of the night felt like peace.